Yeah, that's right. I think there are two things. I mean, when you're looking at innovation, you're really focused in on that product or service and refining it. And the first point of call is to test it in market with your target market or who you think your target market are, right? But there is a whole another group of very important stakeholders that can either influence or be influenced by your project or your product. And some of those stakeholders will have a lot of power. And if you don't manage them in a way that is constructive, then those stakeholders can become disruptors, or they can really halt your project. So you might say that we've got these really great family values up here, and yet we're expecting everyone to stay in the office until 7:30 p.m. every night, regardless of your family commitments. Those two things are in conflict, and culture will trump whatever else is going around. I don't quite know what I was thinking, to be honest, and it landed so flat, as you can imagine. They felt that I had misunderstood their business. They felt that there was no real engagement. And even though I had done some of the canvassing, I probably just hadn't done enough engagement with the directors as well as some of the key leaders within the team. I had got feedback, but I hadn't done enough engagement. They didn't trust me. And then I'd leapt way too far. I pushed them way too far along. I'd come up with a whole set of values. I'd come up with a whole set of statements. So we started again, basically, and I did far more workshopping one-on-one, and then we got them to co-create the values and the statements, and that ended up being a success.
So, hey, look, thanks very much for making time. Really appreciate it. And I would really keen, I'm sure our audience is to hear about your journey and how that sort of evolved into human-centered sort of innovation design sort of practices as well. So please share a bit about your background.
Sure. Thanks for having me. So I grew up in Melbourne and went to school there as well. And I guess when I was at university, I ended up studying a double degree. I studied business marketing and arts, majoring in philosophy and ethics. And when I finished university, the career advice I had at the time was that I could either work in the not-for-profit sector or maybe lecture philosophy at university, or I could go into the business world. Sort of like these two things were so separate. And yet I always thought that those critical thinking skills that I learned in philosophy were absolutely crucial in the business world. So anyway, I went into the business world. I actually worked in Melbourne for a while, working for advertising agencies, and it's a relatively brutal stage of my career. Crossed over to not-for-profit for a while, worked for one of Australia's largest charities, the Cancer Council. And then I left and worked in London for a little bit too, where I worked for Bupa Hospitalist Division over there, and had the amazing experience of working for a year with Bupa, which was Bupa Healthcare, a Provident organisation, and then they were taken over by private equity. So I got to see that cultural shift within an organisation, and that was probably my first insight into, the importance of organisational culture. Came back, met my husband over there, came back and lived in New Zealand after that. And when I got to New Zealand, we were living in Marlborough, and I immediately realised that I needed to understand how New Zealand worked. And quickly I realised that there is an incredible ingenuity, entrepreneurial spirit here that I could feel. And I needed to understand what, my marketing skills and my sort of understanding of culture, how could that work in the New Zealand context, particularly working with either small and medium-sized businesses, startups, or people that have innovative ideas or concepts wanting to get that to market. And I guess over the next, 10 years of my life, when we moved from Marlborough to Christchurch, I was working in that space, in that communications and culture area. And that led me to work with some really interesting small and up-and-coming businesses on their brands, on their purpose, on their values, authentically communicating those brands and looking at how to internally capture that brand and create a really vibrant culture that kept people motivated. But it was probably about 5 years ago that I realised that there was a bit sort of missing link I felt in my career and in my learning, and it was still in that idea of corporate social responsibility, this concept that I had when I was back at uni of, what is it about the ethics of a business that can make it really strong, and how can we look at that? So I ended up doing my MBA at UC, focusing in on sustainability and looking at that through the commercial lens, how you can use sustainability as a springboard for innovation, as well as to transform organisational cultures and represent authentic brands. A key piece of work that I did, actually, my final project that I did for my MBA, focusing in on this area, was for the company Montreal. It's a fantastic Kiwi brand with Merino's performance wear, particularly for the mountains, so mountain biking and skiing, etc. And they're at the forefront of, I guess, fabric innovation, using merino in performance way. But they were really interested in understanding how the future would look for performance apparel, for sort of sports apparel. What are the headwinds that are coming the way of apparel? So, we're looking at waste to landfill. We're looking at circular design, all those sorts of things. So they got me to do a piece of work looking into the future. So it was effectively future scenario analysis. And then taking that information and distilling that into a series of recommendations was what my project was about. And I won't tell you what those recommendations were, but one of the recommendations was actually about ensuring that the culture of the organisation had the internal mechanisms in place to ensure that they were agile and able to move when those headwinds hit or before, so they weren't caught out in a time of rapid change, which is what we're facing in the moment. So you could sort of see how some of the recommendations were about what was happening with fabrics and what was happening in the recycle repair market. And some of those recommendations were about how do we manage that internal, or we don't know what the future is like. And that comes back to culture.
How much of that was a surprise for the organisation?
I think because we're dealing with some pretty smart people over there, I think they could see a lot of what was coming certainly in the near term. The thing that is much more difficult is actually that culture change piece, right? Because that requires daily work. The brilliant thing about Mons, of course, is that they had pretty amazing leadership over there, and I'm pretty sure they'll have it sorted.
So that's sort of largely your journey up to the sort of MBA piece. So what have you been sort of working in and supporting organisations sort of since then?
Yeah, well, I was thinking about this in specific relation to human-centered design, and I think the way that I sort of look at this is that my work is very human-centered, and it often works to facilitate that human-centered design and innovation piece. So I often work with businesses on trying to collect information from all of their stakeholders to inform prioritized strategy that then leads to solving complex problems within their business. So that sounds very abstract at the moment, but if you think about some of the sustainability challenges that we're facing at the moment, businesses are facing all sorts of different regulatory changes. They're wanting to make sure that compliance comes to a certain level, but if they're wanting to lead in a market, they're often needing to come up with an innovation in order to sort of leapfrog their competition, and that can be by using sustainability. So what I do is work with businesses to canvass different stakeholders to try and get feedback in order to inform strategy and inform a pathway towards an innovation, I guess. So it's probably at that discovery stage, I would say, but then probably also in the implementation stage at the end.
Okay, so in a typical kind of project, you're out there gathering this feedback, this data, and distilling insights, yeah, about how you might, but who are your stakeholders, and how you might need to communicate to them. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, a really great example of that was last year I was working with a large freight transport company who obviously has got some significant sustainability issues because they burn diesel as part of as their core business, basically. But this particular company was wanting to work out how to use what they do and try and become sort of greener over time as part of their capital improvement for their CapEx program, basically. What we had to do is we had to speak to all the different stakeholders in the business, whether that be truck drivers, board members, suppliers, to to the business, their clients, try and get feedback to work out what that might look like in a commercial sense. What does sustainability look like for them, and how can we do that together by partnering and facilitating collaborations within the organisation as well as external to the organisation. And I'll give you a really nice example that sort of falls out of that. Now, this wasn't with this particular company, but it was aligned. A great example of using information from a broad range of stakeholders is that it can create solutions to a sustainable problem. So I read this year that in about June, New Zealand Post and Hyundai had teamed up to create their first hydrogen-powered truck. So they were doing a trial in the North Island. New Zealand has a significant issue with freight. I knew all about this because I've just been working with my client on this very issue. The technology isn't there yet, but we need trials in market to test. Now, if Hyundai and New Zealand Post had just worked together, they wouldn't be able to solve the problem, because you also need to have some sort of fuel or energy supplier to also come on board in that partnership. They're a key stakeholder in this. So they worked with, I'm just going to look it up here, Haringa Energy, to help create a refueling network in a particular area. And they also had to work with TR Group, which was the truck maintenance company. So even though Hyundai's client was NZ Post, they had to work with all of these other stakeholders in order to ensure that the innovation was a success. And I guess getting that feedback and from all those different stakeholders and bringing them to the table creates opportunities for collaboration, which enables innovation.
Yeah. Okay. So in your experience, like, is that piece often overlooked? Like, very insular, sort of focused around the idea as opposed to the whole system, if you like.
Yeah, that's right. I think there are two things. I mean, when you're looking at innovation, you're really focused in on that product or service and refining it. And the first point of call is to test it in market with your target market, or who you think your target market are, right? And that's great. And that's really important. And that sort of trialing and iterating piece in the Duck Tree model, I think, is really clear on that. But there is a whole another group of very important stakeholders that can either influence or be influenced by your project or your product. And some of those stakeholders will have a lot of power. And if you don't manage them in a way that is constructive, then those stakeholders can become disruptors, or they can really halt your project. And I experienced that firsthand when I was working in London. We had an innovative product that we were going to market with at Bupa. We knew that the patients wanted it. We knew that the hospital administration wanted it, and we went to market. And the GPs and the consultants, who were the people offering this particular product/service, actually, didn't have anything to do with it. They had no interest in it, and they had high power. So we had to go back to the drawing board, get their feedback, and then relaunch. And it delayed us by a year. And that was probably the first time that I understood stakeholder engagement, but I didn't have any of the terminology, or I had no idea of, the theory behind it at that stage.
Yeah, interesting. Would like to get your thoughts around, you've framed it as high influence. Yeah. Okay. But I was recently reading just a particular case study where actually what they'd done is they'd done this analysis around, I think, who was influential and that sort of thing. I think they were running an event. They'd forgotten about the parking attendant. And so this is the person who allowed the vehicles to come through, was checking the vehicles prior to them going into the car park. So nobody had even consulted this person, and they didn't even realise how important this was to identify what key vehicles needed to get through fast, and all the rest of it. And so effectively, they held up the whole show, I think, for like over half an hour, or something like that. So when you're sort of looking to dive into, who has influence, how do you determine that? Because obviously, this person really can't influence the whole event so much, but they offer a key part, and that was overlooked. So
Yeah, it's a great question. And so something that I do when I'm working with different clients is that we'll sit down and we'll get as many people in the room as possible from the business. And we just whiteboard a list of all the potential people or organizations or groups that can influence or be influenced by the business or the product. We'll call it the project for now. So be influenced by the project. And we list that, and we keep listing however big or small we think that they are. And we do that in one session, and then we stop, and then we just let people sort of think. I think it's really important to think these things through, because often the parking attendant comes up and someone goes, oh, actually, they're really important. Then the next thing to do is to start a ranking process. And a really good way of doing that is and a simple way, if your stakeholders aren't too complex, is to rank them on sort of one side of power and influence, and on the other side is interest. So you rank them. You could do, high, medium, and low. It's meant to be. It's not a science. It's certainly what you think their powering interest is, and that enables you to put them on a matrix. And what you'll find is when you start plotting these different stakeholders, they fall into about 4 quadrants, and you can work out which of your stakeholders have high influence and high interest in your project, and which of your stakeholders have low interest and low influence. And then you can work out how you are going to communicate to each of those different stakeholder groups. And some of those will be personal interactions, and some of them will be simply, we just need to include them on the newsletter list.
So in the case like that with the parking attendant, where perhaps would you have placed them?
I would have said, let's have a look. Actually, high power, low interest.
On that one key element they are responsible for.
And the reason that they're high power is because they can influence the success of the project. So they could influence the success of the event. And that's why they're high power.
Yeah. And I guess it's, reframing what does it mean by high influence or high power?
Yeah.
It's not just in the perceived role or that sort of thing in terms of how many people report to you and all the rest. It's actually the whole system, the whole team.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so the word influence is really good. Can they influence the outcomes for better or worse? And if they can do that quite easily, that's a high position on your grid.
You may have touched on it before, but I'm really keen, like, what compels you to kind of work in this really human-centric, discovering kind of way? Often we're there to solve a problem, get from A to B as fast as possible. But I've now just heard you talk through this real discovering process, and I've heard you use the word "let's sit," and have my words to help people sort of percolate on things. So why is this important to work in this way for what you're doing?
I think to answer the first part of your question, I think my training in marketing gave me a really good grounding in trying to understand the needs of other people. So marketing communications people are trained to, develop a sort of sense of deep empathy about their target markets to try and understand their motivations and deep needs. So, and I think that I've always brought that into everything that I do. I do take a bit of a human-centered approach to business anyway. I like forming strong relationships. That's a natural state for me. But I think it's really important when you are dealing with complex problems because we're going to have probably we're going to need diversity of thought around the table. We're going to need different insights from different people who have different things at stake, so stakeholders, in order to solve those complex problems. And as we're seeing with generative AI, we're getting really quickly to insights these days, but we also need to allow ourselves the time to critically think about those insights to ensure that we are capturing everyone's point of view well enough to create a solution that people want. That critical thinking piece, it's what sets us apart as a species, really. And it is absolutely essential. And you can't critically think really quickly. You need time to marinate, to percolate. You need time to allow your mind to, sort through all of the information that we have, that we're able to bombard ourselves with at the moment. And so that critical thinking piece is essential. And when you ask people their opinions and take the time to sit down with them to canvass their thoughts, you're actually giving them permission and time to critically think. And I think people really value that.
That's the key point, right? It's important that they have that permission to contribute.
Yeah, absolutely.
Probably brings us off to a little bit around, implementing these sorts of things. If people don't have permission, I mean, my sense of it is that, they sort of say, well, why should I be involved in successful outcome of something? So if they don't have that permission to actually contribute up front, early on, be part of that whole journey piece,
Yeah.
Um,
And that, interestingly, the extension of that is culture, right? So what you're trying to do is you're trying to build a bit of a culture of engagement and collaboration around your initiative or your project. And if you're bringing people along with you, even with differing views, that's fine. If they're involved in the process, they're going to be far more engaged and interested in the outcomes than if you just drop it on them at the last minute.
yeah. So with that said, could you maybe dive into a bit about how you have typically helped people to sort of get on that journey, but that whole starting successful culture shift?
Yes. Well, interestingly, culture is one of those interesting. Actually, I should give you a definition of culture. And the way that I was talking to someone about this the other day is really it's the social order of your business, and it shapes the attitudes and behaviors of your team. And we know the culture is really important because it is absolutely intrinsically linked to performance, to motivate, and to motivation. And so when you're looking at sort of organizational culture, you're talking about those, not necessarily the values that are stuck up on the wall. You're talking about the way people behave in the office. So you might say that we've got these really great family values up here, and yet we're expecting everyone to stay in the office until 7:30 p.m. every night, regardless of your family commitments. Those two things are in conflict, and culture will trump whatever else is going around, for want of a better word. So the way that I work with culture is exactly, first of all, canvassing the situation. So talking to as many people at all levels of the organisation individually, to pull in as much information as I can about what is working, what's not working, what does the aspirational culture look like, what are some of the values that we would like to see enshrined, what are some of the behaviours we need to let go of. And we pull that all together and look at it with the frame of reference of what the business wants to achieve. So if the business is in really high growth, we need to ensure that the culture is reflective of that high growth stage. So how do we embody that without burning out our staff? And so in the end, you end up with a sort of a co-creation of culture. There's no way I could go into an organisation and say, this is your culture, here it is, hand it over. You absolutely have to make sure that everybody is involved. And a couple of years ago, I worked with a small firm here in Christchurch, an accounting firm, who was looking at their culture. And we did that. We talked to everyone in the business. Everyone was on board, which was great. And then we did a series of workshops to talk about what what good looks like. What does good look like? What's an example of great behaviours? What's an example of negative behaviours we want to let go? And how do we celebrate these behaviours going forward? And in the end, success for me was me walking out and leaving their little sort of, culture team, for want of a better word, to go on and keep working on the culture moving forward, because it is always something you have to work on.
Okay. So I just want to pick up on that, but let go of.
Mm.
So obviously, if we're talking about behaviours, the behaviours of people,
Yes.
and how challenging has it been, or do you have any sort of advice there around, dealing with that situation where obviously somebody or a few people will be feeling that that's the behaviour that others have identified that I need to change effectively.
Yeah, it can be really tricky.
Sure.
The first thing I would say is you 100% have to have leadership on board with the process, because quite likely some of the things to let go will be something that one of the leaders also has to let go as well. So that's number one. And I think without that, then you don't get that reinforcing at the leadership level. What I've found is that when I've spoken and I canvass the different thoughts from around an organisation on what to let go, is the same thing often comes up time and time again. And by the time you're at the second or third meeting, the people that are perhaps acting in this way have identified that they don't want to act in this way. They won't necessarily tell you that it's them, but they'll also agree that it's something to let go. So it's a process and it takes time. It's not something you can say, right, we're going to resolve our culture on Wednesday next week at our workshop. You need to repeat it over the course of a 6, 12, 18-month period in order to get everybody on board. And that's because people need to marinate and think on their own behaviours and what they want their behaviours to be in the future. And that actually is the second point. So first of all, taking the time, number one, to really understand why and what people want to let go. And number two is starting to get everyone to think about the aspirational culture. Mm-hmm. So what's better? What is it that we want to look like? And what's an alternative to this behaviour? And what do we need to do in order to ensure that behaviour stops? So, for example, if the boss is always staying till 7:30 p.m. every night, and everyone else feels guilty for leaving early, maybe that's because that person is not delegating enough. So how do we ensure that their workload is a little better to help them get out of the office a little bit earlier? Or is it that person comes out at 5:30 and says everyone can leave? You don't have to say it's just me, I've got nothing else to do.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing, though. I think I'm sort of picking up from what this whole conversation that we've had is, we had the word permission there before, but I guess in some of this process of culture change, it's also people realizing that they have agency in all of this.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Because my sense of, I've worked in a few organizations and, you feel it's being done to you.
Yeah.
As opposed to we have control and we have choice around how we're going to be actively shaping this or not.
Mm-hmm.
Because we will have a choice whether we want to work somewhere or not, right? Ultimately, obviously, there's a few constraints sometimes around that, but I think people forget that and it gets in the way with do whatever the boss says. Yeah.
I think that's absolutely right. And that co-creation piece, that is key to that, making everyone feel like they are contributing to create this aspirational culture, that everyone has the ability to sit down and talk through what they like and what they don't like, and then come to an agreement together on around what that culture should look like. The other thing that, you can do off the back of that is work on some focus behaviours that the whole team think that, that they all need to get better at. So say, for example, it's identified that, they've been working in silos and they need to work on collaboration. So it might be, they might have 4 key focus behaviours, but you just choose one to work on at a time. And everyone agrees that they need to get better at collaboration. Then we work out how to make that possible? Do we do some workshops? Do we facilitate some teams coming together? What is that? But they've identified that that's where they need support. So it is absolutely about co-creation, and it is not about dictating a culture down. It's about creating a culture that everybody creates. And also, the other nice thing about working in the culture space is that the leaders of the cultures aren't necessarily the leaders of the business as well. And so you get a really nice different range of people who step into the culture space to be part of it. And then you start to see some of the metrics change. So your retention and attrition rates are better. You're able to attract better talent because you've got this great culture. You're definitely not dealing with some of the productivity issues that you've been dealing with before. And that data is, you can see that's actually proven.
Can you perhaps expand a little bit more around this whole 12 to 18 month process? So I take it originally we had some one-on-one conversations around culture.
Yeah.
So imagine we're an organisation, we're wanting to become more innovative, right?
Yeah.
So one thing is actually sort of coming up with ideas, but then and then trying to test things out. Okay. But then how do we actually embed a better way of becoming innovative in an organisation?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. And I guess absolutely you start the approach at the very start that I've talked through already. But where the rubber hits the road is actually in the consistency and frequency of bringing up and reinforcing and celebrating the kind of behaviors that you need in order to create an innovative mindset within the business. So, for example, you might be saying, so collaboration is obviously a key one. So you want to, perhaps in your monthly meetings, to have a standing agenda item on what are the three teams that are collaborating at the moment, what are they achieving at the moment, give them a 5-minute feedback session, for example. It might be that there is somebody launches an ideas box or has an ideas session once every month to come up with all sorts of no ideas the bad idea sort of thing. Maybe there is also a seminar that we do during this period that talks about making sure that the environment is not one of fear or blame, and that people feel confident in either challenging the status quo or putting forward a new idea that they won't be ridiculed. So that's a cultural piece as well. So it's about creating repeated and consistent ways of reinforcing the culture and embedding that into the processes of the business. And then where there are gaps or where there might be areas like that, for example, fear and blame, working on educating the team on how best to let go of that behaviour and create a new one.
Right. So, and when you're working with an organisation, right? So we're going there and we've done that discovering, and we've got a bit of a framework about some things we need to address.
Yeah.
And you support that with, perhaps a meeting structure or something like that, right?
Yeah, it can vary.
How do you at that time also talk to them about, this, that we are learning as we're going. This is iterative, and we are trialing these things out, right? So, what any sort of words of advice around how to manage that sort of initial pushback that you might get from occasional people?
Yeah, well, I think because this is, we're talking about soft skills here, and we're talking about often bringing people a little bit out of their comfort zone when they might be working in more linear fashion, and that can feel confronting sometimes, and it can feel like, you're not really as safe in your workplace as you might have been before. So making sure that those foundations are right are around making people feel safe and secure, that they are able to speak up, is really important. But that learning cycle, I think, is absolutely key. And in a couple of the organisations that I have worked with, a way that they've embedded the learning, that the idea of learning is that there was a once a week celebration of either a failure that was a rapid iteration, so it's something that's happened that was a learning. So reframing failure as a learning experience as well as a success. So making sure that those two were tied together so that people felt really confident about the aim was progress and moving forward in a positive way, and sometimes you have to fail to get there.
Love it. And what sort of coming to mind for me as you're talking about this is just circling right back to this whole beginning of discovering. And tell me if I'm joining the dots right on this, but it sounds to me like on the implementation piece, the more that you've done in the discovering and learning about their culture, and I kind of think about it in the way of through my mistakes, is that I used to use the term that you need to kind of meet people where they're at, or the organisation where they're at, but just slightly sort of stretch them.
Yeah.
Because I've certainly gone into organisations to help them before and kicked off and started doing all this stuff out here that was so foreign to people that they just ignored it.
Yeah.
And I couldn't reconcile, this is great, sort of thing. I guess from saying, how do you get enough sense of where that organisation is at and how much you can sort of accelerate them through that kind of process,
Yeah, it is different for different organisations, but I think you hit the nail on the head there when you say that, you've got to meet people where they're at and slightly stretch them. Even when you know that the goal is that, the goal is much higher, taking people on a journey is critical. And so part of that, I guess, culture building piece is about creating behavioural change, but it's also about trying to create some structures internally that allow people to be their best selves. And it sounds a little bit fluffy, but without that, you're going to find that you lose people along the way and they're going to jump off the boat. And it's particularly relevant, I guess, when you're thinking about innovation, because people need to be free to think in different and obscure and interesting ways. They need to be free to collaborate in really different ways. And, my greatest joy is when I see people that have been working in silos suddenly break free of that and start to collaborate across an organisation in order to solve a complex problem. Culture is the conduit for that, I think. Yeah.
Could you also maybe share a little bit around what I find is when I've worked with organisations is it's difficult for people to grasp that this discovering piece can be a bit open-ended for them.
Yeah.
Right. So how do you put in place, how do you reassure people that it's not going to be a never-ending sort of scenario?
Yeah, absolutely. You absolutely have to truncate it in that and celebrate the small wins along the way. So you're never going to be able to discover everything, and you're never going to be able to be 100% certain on that your discoveries is it pointing you in an exact direction. I mean, that's very rare. So what I like to do is spend some time discovering, so speaking to all the different stakeholders in my case, including customers, potential customers, etc., and distilling the themes from that and then presenting on what we know so far. Now, what often is the case? So, for example, if I'm doing a discovery piece to work out what the sustainability challenges are within a business and how we might solve them, what often happens is that I'll be talking to people, and maybe the engineering team might have a really good grasp of all the different possibilities, but everyone else, board members and, suppliers, have got a very narrow understanding of what sustainability is or could be just because of their frame of reference. But that's okay. That's actually really solid information anyway. So bringing that together and creating a priority list to move us forward in the short term, to get us to that sort of trial, that iteration and trial stage, is actually really important. At that stage, that's when you can go back and refine and start to discover a little bit more. But getting you to that first stage, from that first stage to the second stage, I think is really key. And without it, it ends up being sort of endless, and nobody's going to enjoy a non-outcome situation.
Look, I'm really keen to sort of hear a little bit about, you share a few success stories, but I'd like to hear a little bit about some of the challenges and, big learnings that you've had from trying to work in this way or shift culture or whatever you'd like to share.
Yeah, okay. Oh my goodness. I'll give you a great example of me trying to shift a culture and coming in with the solutions. So I was working here in Christchurch with a firm, and we were working on, it was probably a professional services firm. They probably had about 40 staff, so small business. And they asked me to come in and look at their culture, look at productivity. And I spoke to a few people internally, a few of their staff, and then I went back to my desk and I pulled all of that little bit of information together, and then I wrote a whole culture strategy for them and presented it to the directors. And I don't quite know what I was thinking, to be honest. And it landed so flat, as you can imagine. They felt that I had misunderstood their business. They felt that there was no real engagement. And even though I had done some of the canvassing, I probably just hadn't done enough engagement with the directors as well as some of the key leaders within the team. I had got feedback, but I hadn't done enough engagement. They didn't trust me. And then I'd leapt way too far. I pushed them way too far along. I'd come up with a whole set of values. I'd come up with a whole set of statements. So we started again, basically, and I did far more workshopping one-on-one, and then we got them to co-create the values and the statements, and that ended up being a success. And instead of it taking 6 months, which was the original timeline, it took nearly 2 years, and that's probably about right, to be honest. And that is, when you're dealing with culture change, you can't rush it. You need to not only get the feedback, but you need to engage. You need to form trust between the different groups. So yeah, that was an epic failure. I remember being up at night thinking, what was I doing? Another one I think that I can talk to, I guess, was when I was working in Australia for the large charity, and we had a setup there where I was working for the Australian office, and then each of the different states and territories around Australia also had their own office. And we were doing a digital transformation and creating this innovative new portal that to house the branded communications. The first thing that I did was I pulled this portal together, and I thought it was the be all and end all, and I'd never seen anything like it before. It was, literally websites were just starting. No, it's not true, but it was quite innovative at the time, and not a single state or territory wanted to use it, even though I trained all the staff, and it was an absolute disaster. And so what I ended up having to do is go back and visit every single one and engage with them directly, talk to them about why or why not it's going to work, adapt the product. And then in the end, it worked, and it took 2 years instead of a few months, but it ended up being a treat. So it was once again that engagement piece in key stakeholders was something that was absolutely missing, and that I just assumed they would love the product because it would make their life easier. Well, they didn't love it.
Just so that we sort of start to look to wrap things up, I just wonder if you could share 2 to 3 really, really critical pieces or tips that if somebody is looking to work in this way around stakeholder engagement, culture change, what's the top sort of 3 things that come to mind for you?
Yeah, I think the first thing is, being conscious of being as open-minded as possible and leaving your ego at the door. So try not to have any preconceived ideas or solutions in mind when you're getting feedback and asking people for their opinion, because it's very easy to lead the witness, when you're talking with people. If you start to hear that that something's reinforcing your idea, it's very easy for you to jump onto that as if that's the key insider, and it might not be. So having an open mind and leaving your ego at the door, I think is critically important. And I think the other thing that we've touched on, and I do want to reiterate, is giving yourself and the people you're working with the time to think. thinking is really important and it takes time. And I think allowing that space will give you better insights. Use AI to help distill lots of data into themes and findings, but you then use your critical thinking skills and those around you to come up with really interesting and new ways of solving obvious problems. Yeah.
Just want to dive in a little bit, Eliza, around that word space. So, again, speaking to how busy organizations are, the fast pace of change, wanting to have the answer, yesterday. How, what are some good approaches or that you've either seen or helped implement yourself around creating enough space to allow thinking,
Mm,
allow that collaboration even?
mm. Um, I I hadn't thought about this in real detail, even though I had done some of the practices until I'd done my NDA on net, and there's a real focus in the NDA on giving your mind space to think. And I then adopted a few things. So one of the things that I started doing when I work for myself, from my own, and it's quite lovely, but when I was working in office, I would uh, walk around the block and have a think. So take a breather, go for a walk, get some fresh air, take some deep breaths, and allow the mind to think. I think I often worked with lots of creatives, so people who are artistic, designers, and we used to talk about nurturing the creative mind. And the way that we enabled that was allow our teams to take a couple of hours off to do something nurturing. So whether it would be stroll through the gallery, walk through the park, maybe sketch. One of my designers once came back with this amazing sketch of this beautiful deer she'd just done in park. It's amazing. Like just allowing yourself to get into a place where you're free to let your mind roam, because I think we have something in front of us at all times, that freedom to roam. Even you know, podcasts, audiobooks, you're cooking now and you've got your audiobook in. And I think that stops you from thinking. So creating time, whether it's walking, whether it's just, sitting in your backyard and having a cup of tea without anything in front of you is really important.
Eliza, look, thank you very much. This has been amazing. I've certainly learned a lot. I'm really looking forward back to going back and listening to this around culture change, stakeholder engagement, communications, all that side of things. So, hey, thanks again for making the time. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure, Warren. Thanks.